and I and Mr. Hodges, the chairman. I'm going to certify that we have a quorum. We have all three members as appointed by the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. My opening comments are we've got a very, and we published an agenda that involves basically discussion of any amendments, the nominating committee's chair's opening comments, the overview of the process and charge, general discussion and next steps. Basically, the initial meeting, not expected to make any decisions, but want to find out what information we need as a committee to make our recommendation to the CVTA. Chairman, Mr. Thornton provided me, well, first I'm going to follow the agenda. Are there any amendments to what I mentioned, anything that we should discuss? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Then my opening remarks are basically Mr. Thornton provided through Todd your a email in which he pointed out that our charge was to provide a recommendation for the offices of chair and vice chair of the authority. Current chair, of course, is Mr. Thornton, and vice chair is Mr. Carroll. And then the second charge was the members of the finance committee that are not automatically appointed, and the ones that are automatically appointed because of population are Richmond, Chesterfield, and Henrico. We have to recommend, and at present there are two members appointed by the authority. And I know, oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, that's very helpful. And there are two members, and those are Mr. Peterson and Mr. From Goochland, Spoonhauer. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that is correct.
So this is one of the purposes of this meeting, to make sure we know who we're. And the specific charge, which is attached to your minutes for the, let's see, for the nominating committee, I think is on page 2.
Yes, but what I had put on there was that we it would address the additional membership of the finance committee, but I may have had that wrong, so just ignore that. I typed it really quick just now and didn't realize you were also going to be dealing with the two members, right? Correct.
That's what I understand the charge is. The others that are being discussed are at least not on the table at this point.
Okay.
So on page 2 of the of our bylaws, it says, forgive me for reading it, nominating committee at a regular meeting held preceding the annual organizational meeting at which the elections of officers will be held, and that's July. The chair shall recommend a nominating committee subject to approval of authority. We were approved last Friday. At the annual organizational meeting, nominating committee shall submit the names of one or more persons for each office to be filled. Additional nominations may be made by members at the annual meeting. So to summarize, I think our charge is to recommend the chair and vice chair and two members of the finance committee, other than I'll call them the big three, Richmond, Chesterfield, and Henrico, to take office in July of this year and to serve a year. I'd further comment that last year I served on the nominating committee. Ms. Page was the chairperson, and basically we recommended, because it was early in our organization's history, that we basically keep the same officers in place. So we had a pretty easy test a year ago. This year, I think we've got to contemplate whether, I guess, our options, and I'm just going to put these out there. I think our options, obviously, to recommend something similar to continue the officers we have, but I think the goal in appointing us would be to perhaps look at a rotation and what is a reasonable process. And along that line, and anyone who wants to stop me, we're in discussion mode. I think it would be of interest to know what our other regional transportation organizations in Northern Virginia and in Hampton Roads do with their rotation, just as an example. The option that we have, I guess, as an example with the RRTPO, is it rotates annually, typically by alphabet of the jurisdictions of the elected officials, does not include any appointed officials. And I'm not seeing any prohibition against having non-elected officials that we may need some legal advice on who we are considering to fill the positions. But do we establish some kind of rotation system? I was trying to think of an example. You have a situation where, and this is somewhat unique to our organization, where Richmond, Chesterfield, and Henrico are basically guaranteed participation in the Finance Committee. Should they also be basically the chairs? There'll be a rotation of chairs of this committee, and then the other 6 jurisdictions have a rotation, alphabetically, whatever, of the vice chair. And in that way, you had a sequence where whoever the chair of the Finance Committee, or we may do this for a future year. I would assume the current vice chair would move up to chair, and potentially you have whoever the chair of the Finance Committee, which would be of the larger group, move up into the chair position, and one of the 2 members of the Finance Committee that are not part of the larger group could move up to the vice chair or something like that. I've just made it more complicated than it needs to be, but I think that's sort of the dilemma that we need, because I'm not sure this organization could function like the RRTPO. We're an authority. I think we do things, we have powers that it's not a planning organization, it's more an executive organization, and it's structured obviously with the larger jurisdictions basically in the driver's seat. So I'm putting my thoughts out there. I think we'd like to know what others are doing, and welcome any general thoughts from the members at this point.
Mr. Chair, just
I'm sorry, Mr. Pearson.
Clarification on your earlier point.
Yeah.
The existing folks that are in the positions nominating committee is considering is Mr. Thornton as chair of the authority, Mr. Carroll as vice chair, and then in the Finance Committee, the 2 seats that nominating committee is tasked to consider are currently held by Mr. Peterson from Hanover and Mr. Brown from the Commonwealth Transportation Board.
Oh, Mr. Brown.
It's not Spoon Hill.
Okay, it's not. Okay, interesting.
So just a question.
Yes.
Are you, this rotation, are we talking about this?
Time around,
Yes, where you're looking, and I know we're just
we're just talking.
getting basic information, and I would like to get some sense of what others are doing as well for our next meeting, but.
My assumption would be that Mr. Carroll, since he's vice chair, would move into the chair's position.
So we're not talking about this rotation for this next cycle?
Not in terms of the chair.
Okay.
Okay. I maybe confuse things.
No, I've just,
So
no.
who would be the vice chair? Potentially that could be the chair of the finance committee, for instance, the mayor.
For this next go round.
For this next go round.
And then I know we're just throwing this, and then the rotation, whatever that sequencing would start with the next.
Yes.
Is what you're saying.
Yes, I think this would obviously take a lot of explanation, but my experience with the nominating committee last year was that the jurisdictions that are not a part of the big three felt a little left out in the decision-making process. And I think if we basically make a recommendation that's kind of an interim one, where we're moving towards a goal where the smaller jurisdictions, for lack of a better term, would have the vice chair and you'd move up from the finance committee. So there'd sort of be an expectation. And just like the chair, the larger jurisdictions would rotate the chair position. That was a thought that I'm just throwing out there to think about, and but there may be another process that the other organizations use that we want to consider.
So the current would be, just throwing it out there, this is nothing final. The current chair possibly would be Mr. Carroll.
Right.
Vice chair, who's also chair of finance, would be Mr. Stoney.
I'm thinking that that Mr. Thornton would rotate to the chair of the finance committee.
Oh, okay, I hadn't gone that far. Okay.
I hadn't gotten that far either.
So chair would be Carol Stoney. In your scenario right now, you're looking at vice chair. And then for finance, we already have the three represented. So Richmond, Chesterfield already represented.
We don't have anything to say about that.
Right, so we're just talking about for Mr. Peterson and Mr. Brown.
Right, I sort of reached beyond my.
No, I'm just trying to keep.
I'm sorry.
So when we get back together and know
yes,
where we
ma'am,
are?
you're asking the right question.
Okay, and so, and then in regards to that, we want to make sure, I think to your point, that the smaller jurisdictions have opportunity as well.
To be a part not only of the finance committee, but the executive committee.
Right, and so in that case, you were talking about the chair for future possibly being Richmond, Chesterfield, Henrico, whatever sequencing, and vice chair being the other six, whatever sequencing.
With a rotating, yes, whatever.
Exactly. And then finance, okay, we hadn't gotten to finance, except that Quinn Peterson and Brown, okay. And I'm just trying to get the thinking, and then if we could, by next time we meet, get some sense of what others who have similar entities are doing in terms of this. I'm not saying this is not a good roll on the whiteboard or on the table, but just to get some sense from others as well.
Yes, thank you. And we hadn't even, as you said, discussed the rotation of the smaller jurisdictions on the finance committee, whether that would go by alphabet of the localities, whether obviously the CTB representative has to be factored into that, and we've got elected officials. So I'm not sure, I mean, the ones at the state Senate and the House of Delegates. So that's That's another,
It gets kind of complicated.
it does.
Maybe
I can provided that.
And from my perspective of what I'm hearing, if we set this up now to where Mr. Carroll goes in as the vice chair, up to the chair, Mayor Stoney comes in as being the chair of the finance committee, moves into the vice chair's role, right? And then if.
Just for this
Just
year.
for this
Just for this year.
What you're saying.
Right.
I'm just
That's
being
what-
clear.
Yeah, no, that.
Okay.
Because I'm just trying to clarify, because that's the way I understood the way this is being presented. And then after this year, then the nominating committee for next year is gonna have to deal with the
Yes.
next, am I right?
Yes.
And-
Well, but if we set in motion the rotation, then it would be automatic. I mean, if we set the parameters,
Right?
go beyond, after this year, that the chair will automatically be the whomever and the vice will come from the six, then it should just like we do here.
So the
Or,
vice
you know,
chair, after this year,
Yes.
the vice chair would come from one of the six
Locality.
That's
smaller,
what,
Smaller ones, yes.
locality.
that's,
Yes.
Okay, so
with Mr. Hodges.
when the vice chair of the CVTA comes from one of the six smaller localities, because I get that, the smaller locality part of it. Then if you make that as I don't know if I want to use the word policy, but the sort of expected traditional way the policy goes or whatever you want to, but when you go past there, then you always are going to have a small locality vice chair, right?
Right. Or,
Yeah, in this scenario, that would be the
yes,
case.
only in that
Yes.
scenario.
And then if you have that, and then the normal, I think in most situations, is vice chair usually moves up.
Right.
Then your vice chair is going to be, or your chair is going to be a large or smaller locality.
Well, it would have to be clear that the chairman of the finance committee would move up to the chair of the big three would move up to the chair. It's not like, yes, it would be a different kind of rotation. Normally, a vice chair would move up. This would break that and make it a way, and I'm basing this on my discussions from a year ago with this Page group, that it would be a way to have representation in the finance committee and of smaller jurisdictions and a sort of equal representation in the executive committee. And it's just something that I was thinking about, and it provided an example of how to complicate things.
Right.
So we could,
It's that in that way.
Ms. Newell,
I was about to say, so we could make this an easy task, or?
we can make it a complicated
Uh-huh.
one. Yes,
So
right.
the easy task is that we could submit a slate for the upcoming year, period.
And
And
that
start over the next year.
Right, and then we could try to do that homework, and I would still like to know what other entities do
yeah.
to make sure, before we decision.
absolutely.
So it's either we can,
Complicate it, or we can keep it
well,
simple.
we can look prospectively. So we can deal with the current, and then look prospectively in terms of a recommendation. So it's just to say that doesn't sound like we must, but it would be good to at least look down the road and see what others, because it's gonna come back in a year, and a year will go very quickly.
And we're really the first nominating committee that's having to deal with
I
that.
got you.
And
Okay.
Mr. Chair, just to,
Well said.
I appreciate the discussion, and I think it's a great goal. The current charge
it's just a
is the
nomination.
minimum for what happens next year.
Okay.
And I think that there are lots of options as you're discussing for how to come up with a rotation model, and I think that's, obviously it works with our other organizations that we staff. I think that one option could be come up with a slate for FY23
And a process.
with a recommendation to develop a rotation model
during the course of this.
during the course of this year.
To put that
And
out, give
having
them a year
some
to think
entity,
about it.
do we have a committee that could be working on that?
I'm sure the chair would be happy to say.
You may be looking at them.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, and staff,
I mean, you all, that side.
yes, and staff is more than happy to research what the other two authorities in the state do in terms of their rotation models and how their organizations proceed in terms of their officers. It also is worth noting that Finance Committee does have a vice chair as well, which is Mr. Peterson this year. So that can muddy the waters a little bit too in terms of how.
Or not.
Right,
That
or not.
Could just move up to be the chair of the Finance Committee.
Right, so
I'm just,
something else.
if we're looking at, moving where Mr. Carroll was and then up and then finance like that in terms of.
We wouldn't be making a recommendation who's the chair of the finance committee.
No,
We'd just be
no.
saying,
Yeah.
and so that raises the question, do you start fresh? In other words, there are two smaller jurisdictions that have been on for the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Is it time to start some kind of rotation of Goochland or Powhatan or some other smaller group? And then we hadn't even talked about the issue of the CTB representative. Are they smaller jurisdictions? They're not the big three. But the way the structure is set up, as demonstrated by last Friday's votes, the 4/5 population pretty much controls it. So that got me thinking about, well, recognize that and try to give participation to the non-big three group in the finance and in the executive. And it was intended to get us thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And but I like what I'm hearing from Chet, that we keep it simple as we can in terms of recommendation, but I think it would be helpful to raise the issue with the commission of having a process, so you're not having to make it up
Each year, yeah, and if the charge, as you say, we have is just this year, but we can come to the full commission with a recommendation that a committee is appointed that maybe is larger, than us three, and they have, we're very limited with time.
Yes.
If a new chair comes in and sets up, as we suggested and recommended, that they appoint a new committee, which may include us three plus more, which I think it should include plus more. Then you get, I'm saying that because if we get more involved.
No, I'm in agreement.
We get more people to participate in it, it's how we do that, then you have more time to establish that.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Pattern or policy or however you want, the normal rotation that we have with, the TPO, the Plan RVA and other plans. But I think that let's find out what Nova and Tidewater is doing too. That's critical to know what's happening there.
And the goal, I'm hearing the committee say our goal is basically to meet our charge, which is to recommend the slate of officers and consider recommending a process going forward, because this is going to be an interim year, basically.
I would like to say to recommend slate and to recommend the establishment of a work group that would look at the so that by the time we get to the next year, we know exactly.
Right. I completely agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Other than that,
okay. So,
what information do we need that we can ask Chet to provide?
well, I mean, I'd still, if it's not too laborious, some sense of what they do in the other two areas. I'd like, I'm the designated representative for Richmond when the mayor, so I'd like opportunity to just, chat with him a bit. And I'm assuming, the two of you.
And I'm planning to talk to Mr. Carroll about his expectations and other members, so I think it might be helpful. Given the opportunity, we'll reach out before the next meeting and kind of get their sense of their expectations.
Right.
But tentatively, I don't know that we share at this point what's been thrown out tonight.
No.
So, yeah.
Well, it's
Okay.
public information, but it's not something that we.
No, we have not taken a vote on it. This
We
is just
had
what
a example, like earlier today, Miss O'Bannon's sister, who sounds exactly like her. It was intended as an example of how complicated this could be. But I think it's always best to keep it simple as you can.
And we need to come up with 2 members
Right.
for the finance.
So basic to me, it's fairly obvious that the vice chair, Mr. Carroll, has already said he's very interested in being the chair, move up.
I think there's some interest, but I'll have to confirm
Yeah,
by the city representative
would be
in
surprised if there
terms
were.
of vice chair as well.
Yeah.
But I need to have that conversation.
Yes.
But
And so that one's, I don't know whether you keep the CTB representative, whoever that is, and Mr. Peterson as a representative of everyone else. That's kind of an issue. That's where I got into thinking, well, should there be some kind of rotation?
Right.
And I guess we've restated the problem, I guess.
Right. How many members are on the finance committee?
it's 3 plus.
3 plus 2.
Plus 2?
Okay. It's Richmond, Chesterfield, and Rico, then
And if you-
whichever those 2.
They do a lot of business. It's definitely a working.
It's major.
Yes.
Yes, it matters come to us from them. They don't need their committee report. They don't need a second. They've got the support of the staff. So it's not a done deal, but
Right.
it's pretty significant role. So should there be more participation in the region? And the folks we've had, I think the folks we've had have done an excellent job. Got us up and running and we're doing well. So we just have to run the next year's leadership.
And my opinion is finance committee it's an essential position, so any recommendations need to be somebody that is able to fully
Yes.
participate.
Right. Yes.
Again, since I'm not the designated representative, have any persons expressed an interest in serving on the finance committee?
Not that I've heard.
Okay.
Nobody, Mr. Carroll reached out to me, but nobody else has.
Oh,
And not on the finance.
Right, no, I understand,
Yeah.
yeah.
But he's the only one, and to be frank, we've just been appointed Friday. And our goal, I would think, we've got, looking forward maybe to the meeting, our next meeting, or when we need to, what we would be shooting for. CTVA meets, well,
We're trying to determine that,
yeah,
when that next meeting is. I think we have I think if nominating committee could
when would you
work
like
within
us?
a month,
Within
a
a
month's
month.
time, that should be enough. But as the calendars get more aligned, we can certainly, I'll make sure you're updated if anything changes.
Well, neither the CTVA or the RRTPO are gonna meet again until June 2nd, right?
Correct.
Okay, so we need to pick a time and a place that's convenient. It's convenient, obviously, to meet here because we've got it's a public meeting.
What's the deadline date that we need to have the nominations?
We're trying to figure out now what the next authority meeting is going to be based on what happened on Friday. There's a lot of moving parts in terms of the actions that have been taken. So we want to make sure that on the backside, the TAC and the finance committee are able to get together now over the next couple of weeks to do the work that they need to do to make good recommendations to the full authority. So I'm expecting it'll be mid-June at some time, but we don't have a date confirmed yet.
So we should be able to take care of our assignment before the end, at least by the end of May.
That would be our goal.
Okay. All right.
But we
So that
would take a
is-
special meeting. Last year, even though it was simple, we had 3 meetings because at one point we got into an issue in our discussions about whether the CTB representative should stay on the finance committee or should be another locality. And yes, so it may take us 3 meetings, a meeting to sort of lay out what we're contemplating, a meeting to come in with some recommended positions, and then you got to go out and make sure the people who've been suggested are in agreement. Because I'm not sure we need to necessarily ask people, I mean.
I would have, like I said, I'm not the designated, but just knowing the mayor's service as chair of finance, I
think it would be
think
prudent
if it's
to ask.
if it's not chair, it's one of the, yes.
We're not offering a position, would you be interested kind of
Right.
thing. And after our next meeting, presumably come up with a slate, and that we would, subject to the agreement of whoever we're recommending, we'd have the slate. If not, we'd have to get back together and replace it.
So let me ask you this, is there any reason the finance committee can only be 5 members?
It takes a bylaw change.
That's a discussion that was brought up at the last finance committee meeting, but right now, without changing the bylaws, it's 5 members. But yeah, there's been an
It gives
interest in.
opportunity without having it be huge, because we still want it to be highly functional, to still have the 3, Richmond, Chesterfield, and Brighton, the CTB, and then to talk about how the smaller jurisdictions get opportunity
Yes.
to serve, so.
Yeah, at the last finance committee meeting, Mr. Peterson raised the question about whether it should be expanded,
Okay,
so that there is more opportunity for smaller jurisdictions to be part of it. But at this point, that's not the charge of this group.
No, I know, but we can make some recommendations.
Well, if we recommend
Right,
some kind
now,
of process.
the rotation,
Yes.
the size of
We
the
could set
committee,
the
it
table.
could be,
Yeah, we can, yeah.
because we want
absolutely.
it to be inclusive for, all of the jurisdictions to, not just perfunctorily, but, authentically have opportunity.
And I mean, being I'll call myself the rookie on this stage, it sort of appears to me in the initial layout of this authority, I think that the group collectively has really put forth an emphasis to include the smaller jurisdictions. I think that's critical that that's definitely recognized. So how do we enhance the picture after a year of what was pretty tedious work, I would think, setting this up, bylaws and everything else that you had to put together to figure out, it's really good right now,
Yes.
but how can we make it better?
Yes.
And I think that's, even though, as Mr. Parsons says, we're not charged with that, but I do think that's a strong suggestion our committee could bring forth to the full commission.
Right.
And if it's okay with the committee, I'll reach out to Chairman Thornton and make sure he's comfortable with us going in that direction.
Okay.
And he could just say, no, just do what your
Yeah,
charge is.
good.
And that would
We
be
understand
okay.
that.
Yeah,
don't
but
think
I
any
mean,
of us
as
would
we're
have a
trying to
problem.
be thoughtful about
Exactly,
some of the concerns that have been raised. So, just so he knows, we won't feel bad.
No, in fact, that helps us in some ways. I mean, lightens the load.
Yeah, but as we look prospectively to, have this get to be on autopilot in terms of
Even
rotation.
if they add more
yeah.
members, there's
Yeah.
a sort of like rotation and
Yeah.
expectation, which I think provides a level of comfort that everybody's being heard and participating.
Right, it's all inclusive.
Yeah.
And it is a plan,
Right,
and you're
It's at
planning
least-
to work this out.
sure. I mean, expanding it by 3 members, you still have an odd number of 7.
Right.
And so the 3 and then CTV and then 3 from rotating, whichever way we
Well,
figure
yeah,
out for the
absolutely.
smaller.
You could go to the
stitches.
alphabetical as
Yeah,
Mr. Hodges says then.
and so yeah. So,
Something that's
okay.
not personal, it's my entity.
Right,
Right.
So it's a system regardless of the CTV member, for example.
okay. So we will meet again when, because we'll have more information.
Well, Mr. Chair, with this intimate group, it might be possible to actually look at calendars
Yes.
and find a date. Next Wednesday, the 11th, is the regular meeting for the Finance Committee, but we're going to cancel that. So that is free
Say that.
on our side, the
What date?
morning of the 11th.
The 11th.
Oh, okay.
If
fine
that
with that
would work.
day. I
If
don't
that's
know.
enough time, I mean, I know
Yeah.
that
I mean,
you all
well,
need to make.
you were
calls.
gonna get some other.
Get us the
stuff.
information on Nova and Tidewater.
Oh, sure.
Right, and then
Okay.
we were just going, I was just gonna touch base with the Richmond representatives, so, yeah.
That works for me, so I'm
Yeah.
hearing, what time was
It was at, well, I mean, it's at 8:30, but I guess we could
We could
modify
We
the
have some
time.
flexibility. We could do anytime, 8:30, 9:30.
What's
Whatever
the
works best.
pleasure?
9 o'clock, you guys good with
Okay.
that?
9? Works for me. Any other things we need to discuss? Not hearing anything. This meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
We need to talk to Frank.
I'll do the mayor.